Thank you. So today I'm talking to you about open source being good for business and you. And that's a pretty hefty claim, isn't it? So let's see if I can actually back this up. Who am I and why am I talking about this stuff? What do I actually know about it? So let me start by telling what I am not. I am not a coder. I am actually more of an open source wannabe. So I've always been thinking that this is really interesting stuff and I would like to spend time doing it and learning about it. But then I've never really gotten around it because I spent all my time doing other stuff. I have dabbled a little in some projects and helped out a bit with some friends, but most of my efforts have been spent doing quite different things. With Effi, I am a digital rights activist, and among other things, I am advocating for open source. So I've been active in Effi since 2007, and I've been president for a few years. And for example, what we do is when the Finnish government developed Koronavilkku, the COVID tracking application, then we were among the commenters and we were stating that it should be open source so people can review that. And in general, we would like to see more open source, open standards, open access. And at the moment, I also work at a company doing successful business based on open source. This is the first time in my career when I end up working also on the topic, but more on that later. So, here is the beef. What is open source? There is actually not a single unified definition. If you took a bunch of people involved in open source and asked for a definition, you would hear a bunch of different answers. Usually, the thing everyone thinks about is software. Open source software being software where you can access the source code, you can inspect it, modify, enhance. But I would actually call this a rather narrow definition in many ways. And even software side, even if we always think about just the coders, the developers, there are testers, translators, graphic designers, project managers. So there are a lot of different roles. You don't need to be a developer. And for me, open source is more of this community and the way of thinking. Open source philosophy includes values like embracing and celebrating principles of open exchange, collaboratory participation, transparency, and community-oriented working. And of course, for many people involved in open source, there is a strong altruistic angle, people wanting to work together to make the world a better place. And there are usually a lot of strong personalities involved, like of course, as an example, Linus Torvalds, the creator of Linux, who has been known for his very clashing communication style, but that has improved a lot in recent years. So, why should we care about open source, either in the narrow or wide definition? Because you may not realize this consciously, but open source runs the world, from Linux and web servers to embedded systems, from Android phones to Mac computers. OS X, after all, is based on OpenBSD. So maybe open source actually has a branding problem. Any marketing people out there listening? We would not have this world without open source. If you think about the developments during the last 10, 30 years or even longer, with the significance of internet services, everything becoming digital, it's safe to say that we would definitely not have this world without open source. For me, the biggest change point is the World Wide Web in the very beginning. I had just started studying at the university and I ran into this NCSA mosaic. So I'm very grateful to Tim Berners-Lee for not patenting it, not making things closed source, because that has enabled, in a way, all the later developments. There have been a lot of building blocks. And sure, sometimes you end up with this. There's the all modern digital infrastructure, and then there's the teeny tiny component everything relies on. So what happens if something happens to that component? There's just a couple of people maintaining it. There, of course, it doesn't make sense to build critical infrastructure like this, but sometimes this happens and people don't realize it on time. This has actually happened. So how can this be good for business? Last year, we had the whole Logforge incident, which is the critical component being used all over the place, maintained by a very small team on a volunteer basis. So maintainers and the community admirably rallied to provide fixes. But the whole case did provide a lot of food for thought, and hopefully we will see future improvements, that if there are PCs that are identified as critical infrastructure, then those really should not rely on volunteer work only. And let's be honest, it's not only an open source problem. There are a lot of bugs there. There are a lot of vulnerabilities out there. It also happens with closed source, and with closed source it may take a longer time to identify those vulnerabilities. It may take a longer time to get the fixes done if there are not many people who actually know the system inside out. And of course, at least with open source, you always know that you are not locked in with a particular vendor. And there have been cases in the past where a company has taken their service to closed source. So isn't this a huge risk for business? Not necessarily, as they can still use and develop the open source version. This actually again happened last year with Elastic announcing a more restrictive license for Elasticsearch, which is used all over the world. And very fast, a new open source OpenSearch project was announced. And a lot of the people who were using, a lot of businesses who were using the service could just fairly seamlessly transfer over to the new project. And you may remember I mentioned earlier everything becoming digital. And when everything becomes digital, what happens? You have this really huge explosion of data. All those services need data, and data likes to live in databases. And what that means in practice is that there is a whole lot of data. It must all be somewhere, and somebody must manage all those services and make sure that the data is not lost or corrupted, because that would create huge, huge issues. What we have done, and what we are doing still, is that we are creating an ever more complex world. Way back when, we could think about all human beings being basically at the end hunter-gatherers. How many hunter-gatherers are there still around? Not that many. With the advent of agriculture, humans started creating a society that supported many more complex roles. And this has been going on ever since. We need specialists dealing with their sector and its problems and just making life easier for everyone else, making everything possible, making this whole complex modern world possible. And this is where Aiven steps in. We offer a fully managed open source cloud data platform that works for you. The entire business is based on open source. And obviously, this has worked pretty well for us since we have managed to become a unicorn. So in October 2021, we reached the valuation of $1 billion. But we are not unique. Well, of course, we like to think that we are unique, but it's not just Aiven. There is a whole big open source universe out there with a lot of open source unicorns. So just to mention a few names, there's GitHub, Grafana, and Redis. And of course, a common feature with all these services is dealing with data. GitHub stores code. Grafana provides monitoring, metrics, and visualizations. Redis Labs is a data platform. So, if the companies are using open source for their businesses, do they just take it and run it with it? The ethos, of course, is that companies should be paying it back and helping open source to grow. And this is happening to an ever-increasing extent. The companies are paying back. Open source is already critical infrastructure, and companies know this. They need functional open source projects, and they have an interest to reduce the expenses to maintaining them. Sharing the responsibilities, sharing the costs, it's a win-win situation for everyone. And for critical infrastructure, of course, you don't want to burn people out. You don't want the people in the open source projects to stop maintaining the projects because they don't have the time, because they don't have the energy. It makes much more sense for everyone involved to ensure that the project and the people involved stay healthy and productive. Basically, if you name any big tech company, you find something where they are involved in open source, because it is good for them. Meta, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon. If anyone comes up with a big tech company that is not doing open source, I will buy you lunch. So what does Aiven, my employer, do to pay back? We have a lot of staff working on open source. We have one awesome person working in Internet Engineering Task Force, which comes up with all the standards needed for running the Internet. We publish and maintain community projects. And as an employer, we also support our employees who want to contribute in other contexts. We have people coming to speak about open source. We do a lot of advocacy work. We have an internal program called Plankton, encouraging people to do open source also on their free time. We believe that open source delivers the best technology to the industry, and we are proud to play our part in the movement. And we want to ensure that we do our part. We don't want to just take the goodies and run with them. Everybody who uses open source should also do their part. So, I have been saying a lot of things about companies doing open source. And I claimed in the beginning that open source is also very good for you. So, what opportunities does open source provide? There are fantastic opportunities for learning and growth, different experiences. You can find a community to get started, improve your skills, and collaborate within the community. There are opportunities for professional growth, meeting people, working in teams. There are also direct work opportunities. As I said, there are a lot of open source jobs out there, contributors who get paid either as employees through crowdfunding, working for grants, etc. A lot of the pictures in my presentations are from Pixabay, which is again a platform which allows anyone to upload material for anyone else to use freely. But the trick, of course, is always how to get started. What is going on? Are there any local community projects? If you want to start face-to-face instead of just doing things online, are there some options? So in Finland, there are some more meetup groups, and of course with the pandemic, a lot of everything has just been cancelled or moved to those online-only events. I hope that we can now gradually get back on track doing more face-to-face things. But the easiest way to get started is to see if you have some existing favorite project or open source program you use regularly. Find out if they need help. A lot of the time, as I said, there are a lot of tasks in the projects. Or when you join a community and look at things with slightly new eyes, you may see something very worthy of doing that nobody has put to the do list yet because they just didn't realize yet that, hey, this is also something that should be done. Do you like using your software in Finnish? You can participate in translations. Do you have experience in project management? You know, developers, quite often, what they like to do is they like to code. They like to do the programming. They like to think about the software architecture. They might not like so much dealing with all the finicky details with the project managements. Help out with that if you have skills. If you don't have skills, you can learn. Whatever experience and skills you have, I guarantee that you can also use those in open source, and you can learn new skills along. And like I said, I think open source has a really big marketing problem, because if I go to the street and just grab someone and ask them, do you know open source runs the world? They will look at me like I have no idea what I'm talking about. But it is all true. Open source is the basis of modern world in so many ways. If you are more interested in the advocacy side, are there opportunities in your municipality or schools? Should you push for using more open source there? Can you push for more openness and transparency in the budgets or in policy making? Do you have children? Do you want to run some clubs for them? And another starting point would be COSS, the Finnish Center for Open Systems and Solutions, which is a non-profit association that promotes open source, open data, open standards and APIs. If you work for a company that is slightly interested in open source, checking out COSS, maybe joining there as a member and then starting to do activities on that side would be helpful. Some of my favorite projects are things like Mattermost, which is an open source collaboration platform. We use it a lot for writing out all kinds of FE opinions. And Mattermost, which is basically an open source Slack, fully encrypted, fully secure. And everywhere, volunteers are needed. I dare to say that there is not a single open source project which would not need more volunteers. So go out there, find an interesting project. If you want to do this, I'm not saying that this is something for everyone. If you don't want to do this, don't. But if you are even slightly interested, then find out about the communities, find out about the projects, and now that the society is opening up, find out whether there are local meetup groups, whether there are clubs, whether the schools have anything going on. There are a lot of opportunities out there. And if you know something that I haven't heard about, or if you just want to bounce ideas, then I am always very happy to talk about open source. If you like to see something happening, get involved. Things change when you decide to change things. If you want to see the change in the world, start it. It will not be you who finish the change, but you are a key component in getting things done. Thank you.